All right, everyone, welcome to the next edition of DemBiz Briefs. My name is Chris King. I am the president of the Democratic Business Council of Northern Virginia. These briefs are short interviews geared toward giving you an idea of what's happening on the ground in Northern Virginia during this coronavirus crisis. And I'm very pleased to be joined today by Stephanie Landrum, who is the president and CEO of the Alexandria Economic Development Partnership. Stephanie, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
All right, so let's establish a baseline here. What does AEDP do in normal times to help business?
Sure. So AEDP is one of many, probably 10 organizations in Northern Virginia that works at a locality basis to attract and retain businesses in our jurisdictions. And of the 10 jurisdictions in Northern Virginia who actually relatively newly formed the NOVA EDA, which is our alliance, each one of us has a different structure, but we all pretty much do the same thing. And there's two categories of work. Category number one is retention, working with our existing businesses to make sure they can stay in place, they can grow, they can find talent and workforce, deal with day-to-day kind of issues that any growing business has. And then the other kind of bucket of work that we all do is attraction. And that is working with site selectors and commercial real estate brokers and property owners to attract new corporations to our jurisdiction. And then there are probably like 10 to 15 other kind of things that we all are involved in, talent development, placemaking. Some of us work with business improvement districts to kind of help create a sense of identity for different neighborhoods throughout Northern Virginia. Many of us are involved in kind of retail and restaurant attraction. Okay. Not everyone is, but a lot of us who have sort of downtown districts do that sort of work. Mm-hmm. And then I'd say another big category is working on land use. So working with our planning and zoning departments and our elected officials to identify where commercial uses, where there might be demand for them moving forward, and in what parts of our communities we think there should be space reserved for new commercial development. So that's sort of the real estate category. Okay. And I'd say like on an average month, our time is sort of equally divided amongst maybe attraction, retention, and real estate. With a lot of us over recent years, probably more focused on attraction. We had been, as a group, we had decided that it made a lot of sense for us to kind of leave the Northern Virginia, DC market to actually jointly try to attract companies here. And so we had all been spending significant amount of personnel and resources on that kind of external marketing.
Okay. All right. Well, so you got your finger on the pulse, it sounds like, which is perfect. And of course, we'll talk about commercial real estate and some of those other items in just a minute. But I first wanted to ask you about what you're hearing on the ground right now. Obviously, times have changed. What are you hearing from business owners in terms of closures, consolidations, cutbacks, that kind of thing?
Sure. So I think given everything I just explained to you, one of the big changes over the last month has been that the majority of us are now spending maybe 90% of our time on retention and really just working with our existing business community to help them survive this crisis. Our attraction work has pretty much come to a stop, at least during the first few weeks, sure, as we deal with sort of the immediate crisis at hand. What we're hearing from the business community are probably three areas of major concern. One is access to financial assistance, mostly through the federal government, what that process looks like, how it rolled out, and the timeline for which people can receive funding. The second is, genuine concern about their employees and some of the tough decisions that businesses have had to make, either letting people go, furloughing, or just, or having a workforce that frankly can't continue to do their work. Northern Virginia is blessed to have so many different types of industries. So you have some people work completely like on commission, right? And so if all of a sudden the work is dried up, they might still technically have a job, but they don't necessarily have a lot of income coming in. So there's a ton of concern, right, about their employees and workforce. And I think the third category is that we've been hearing a lot about is negotiating or having conversations with landlords about rent. Okay. And the first phase of impact that we all have seen were sort of the frontline businesses, the retail, the restaurants, who depend on day-to-day customer traffic. And we have been, my office in particular has this expertise where we're able to help facilitate conversations between landlords and retailers. I have people on my team who worked on the landlord side in private sector for many years, and so understand sort of the debits and credits on their side of the balance sheet, as well as the pressures of the tenant. And so we've been facilitating those conversations. And Alexandria is, sort of different than a lot of the jurisdictions. We have a little bit of everything. We have just as many mom and pop owned buildings as we do, REITs who own buildings.
Right.
And not to completely generalize, but oftentimes a mom and pop who owns a building can't really sustain 1 or 2 months without rent. Their balance sheet looks pretty tight. And so trying to facilitate those conversations and figure out what works for all parties has been a lot of the work that we've been involved with.
So let's pick up on that commercial real estate piece. And so you've got tenants that need to pay rent so that landlords can pay mortgages. And also, the equity is probably the last thing to get paid in the capital stack on that. But where is the room to maneuver in the capital stack, and does it require a federal intervention to cut some mortgage relief to those landlords?
Certainly, any action by the federal government that would work on that mortgage relief would be extremely helpful across all categories. Short of that happening right now, the conversations that we've been facilitating have been around the idea of partial rent payments over having a conversation, really honestly being transparent and saying, here's what I can afford to pay. And then the second strategy I think a lot of us have been talking through is deferred rent. And so, for a landlord, especially for somebody who is potentially refinancing a building over coming months, one of the strongest benefits of having a tenant is the commitment, right, of the term of the lease. Right. And so we've been talking to tenants and landlords about potentially forgiving or foregoing rent for 2 months in exchange for a deferred payment and then an extension of the lease by 2 months on the back end. And so you're creating value for the landlord by sort of extending the lease and the obligation. And so that has worked, that can work in certain circumstances. I'd say generally, everyone has been sympathetic and responsive. There have been, very, very few instances where we've kind of hit a roadblock. The other dynamic that exists for a lot of these landlords is, the last thing they want to do is have to evict a small business. One, because most people are good people and they understand that this crisis is not anything that the businesses have, created or done poorly at running a business. But number two, just financially, evicting a business, going out and finding a new one, doing tenant improvements for them is actually really pricey. And so when you talk logically to somebody, the idea of maybe foregoing rent or only receiving partial rent for a couple of months is still a better deal than having to have a vacancy and find somebody new to fill it.
Well, and I know that there's a school of thought among landlords that any muscle memory of continuing to pay some rent is good for everybody involved. So that definitely makes sense.
That's right. And some of our, and on that front, some of these frontline businesses that have been hit, the retail and the restaurants, I think during that first, the first week, there was shock and kind of crisis and business sort of dried up very quickly. But one of the amazing things about Alexandria businesses is that they are, a lot of them are independent and a lot of them are really resourceful. And so take a pause for a couple of days. And then they sort of said, oh, wait, how could we, under these new rules of engagement, how could we generate business? And so a lot of them are, I don't want to give the impression that any of them are kind of making what they used to make year over year, but they have embraced delivery. They have embraced curbside pickup. They have done online shopping, with FaceTime. So they are finding ways to continue to make money. And so that whole idea of a partial payment and just being transparent with your landlord about kind of what your situation is, I think is probably our best tactic moving forward.
That is great to hear that people are getting creative and adapting to the extent that they can. So the federal stimulus is out there, the CARES Act. We've seen some rollout of the Paycheck Protection Program. It's been a little bit rocky. Quite frankly, it's an overwhelming number of people that are trying to do it, and some banks that are trying to administer it that weren't really ready for it, let's be honest. So is AEDP helping in that way? And what are you seeing on the ground from a CARES standpoint?
We have at ADP, we have a kind of a subgroup called the Small Business Development Center that is affiliated with the SBA. It gets funding annually from the SBA and is part of a network throughout Virginia. And they actually have significant experience working through disaster loans in the past, following hurricanes, following 9/11, where the SBA deployed their original disaster program, which was called EIDL. And so our team was very prepared to begin kind of counseling businesses on how to apply for those EIDL grants, which were available pretty much immediately, as in
Right.
you could apply for them. Not that you got the money right away, but that you could apply for them.
Sure.
The PPP Act or program was completely new and definitely has had a rocky rollout. Our team has stayed as up to date as possible on what those rules and regs were, how businesses were to apply for that through banks. And we have been counseling businesses pretty much, on the minute of every day. So far, so we're on week sort of 4 officially, I think. So far, we've reached 500 plus businesses. The majority of them have been asking about the financing component. And so what our team does is essentially talk through how you engage with your bank, where the forms are, help people kind of pull together the information that they need to submit, because it is not insignificant. And we started doing that work before the applications were even accepted, so that people could proactively pull together their payroll and the various things that they needed. That said, we're dealing with so much variability, because every business has a different banking relationship. And the way that the PPP is rolling out, you apply through your banks. And so we have been struggling with this idea that there were certain banks that were already qualified to be lenders through the SBA, and then there were banks that were not. But the new CARES Act allows for those banks who were not to pretty much quickly become eligible. And so you had a learning curve on the bank part, you had a learning curve on the business part. The good news, I think, is that we are seeing, just as of the last 2 days, the first dollars hitting the businesses. So, that has been the big kind of milestone hurdle that we wanted to see. Once you can say, oh, Stephanie got her loan, and you can tell 4 other businesses that, I think it creates some hope and some reality that this money is actually going to come through.
Okay, great. And what about, as we step back, what about a regional collaboration? Are you working with other jurisdictions nearby to get economies of scale or otherwise collaborate?
So fortunately, the 10 Northern Virginia jurisdictions, which are Fairfax County, Arlington County, Prince William County, Loudoun County, Fauquier County, and then the cities of Alexandria, Manassas Park, Falls Church, and Fairfax. Got those all memorized. The 10 of us came, thank you. The 10 of us came together last September under this agreement called the NOVA EDA, Economic Development Alliance. And at the time, we were really focused on marketing and attraction, as I mentioned, kind of external actions. And so we had been sort of plugging along over the last few months on creating our brand, telling a better story about kind of the Northern Virginia talent and workforce, and then going out and doing some attraction work. We're now using that structure to figure out, I think as soon as next week, we're going to be launching some educational series for all Northern Virginia businesses underneath this brand. And so so that's number one. Number two, we're moving forward on the workforce front and the talent front. That's a big project that we had already been working on. A learned kind of lesson through our pursuit of Amazon was that, and maybe this is like a duh thing for everyone else, was that for a big company like Amazon, who's going to hire something like 50,000 people, they don't want to hear what the workforce in Arlington looks like. They want to hear what the workforce in the entire metropolitan area looks like.
Right.
And so being able to tell that story, each one of us had sort of individually been telling it, but all agreeing to say, like, here's the story, here's the data, and let's all use the same information, was a big improvement for us. And so we're just finalizing that work.
Okay, good. And speaking of labor, so people are finding themselves downsized, they're being laid off to some extent. are people being able to be repurposed into other industries right now, or is it just a matter of unemployment and kind of riding it out until businesses get back up and running?
So I do think there are a number of programs and partners of ours that are focused on that reskilling on a regular basis, and are certainly available to people who find themselves in a furloughed or layoff position. But one of the things that's kind of unique about Northern Virginia, and I've been talking every week with my colleagues around the state. There are 14 other regions, and we all talk pretty regularly and share best practices. This is one of those times where being dependent on the federal government in terms of our economy is actually going to work in our favor. Because when you look at the number of jobs in this region that are either directly federal government or federal contract, they are not really seeing any contraction. They're seeing changing the way that they work. They're all like this, doing phone calls and meetings from their living room, but the work continues.
Sure.
And so our impacted industries are really like everyone else's: hospitality and front-facing retail. But we don't have manufacturing. We, not much anyway, and other industries that are seeing this kind of second wave of cuts. So I don't want to in any way kind of downplay the impact here, because it certainly is really strong and it's impacting us on many levels. But I don't think there are, in this instance, there are a lot of professional services jobs here that are just working in a new reality, but they're fortunate to still be working.
Okay, that makes sense. All right, so let's look forward a little bit and kind of work through an informal timeline. We've got hopefully a vaccine in progress. We've got a recovery that everybody's hoping gets here as soon as possible. The president is talking about reopening the economy. What do you see as a way to do that responsibly in Alexandria and the region?
I think that one of the things that our city's already talking about are what are those new potential norms in terms of kind of modified social distancing, and what changes can we proactively make in our cluster downtown areas. So an example I'll give is outdoor dining. Outdoor dining is something that we allowed, it's probably been almost 10 years now, but it's something that we regulate pretty heavily. And we're always concerned about how many seats are outside versus inside. Well, so in a new reality where social distancing is potentially still, or call it modified social distancing, people actually might be much more comfortable eating outside than inside. Mm-hmm. And so we are proactively looking at ways to allow for more outdoor dining seats in our restaurant community in advance of a reopening, so that we are positioned to kind of recover quickly. We're also looking at, and we had started to look at this kind of through a different lens before all this happened, but we're looking at some of our streets and sidewalk areas and talking about making them more pedestrian and available for, gatherings, that again would allow for people to maybe saunter back into shopping and dining out in a relatively spread out manner.
Okay, fantastic. All right, well, wanted to give you the last word in terms of what AEDP is doing and what resources businesses out there in particular can look for in the city and with your organization as they try and get back up on their feet.
So my message to businesses in good and bad times is always to seek out their economic development partners. We trade in information. And that's sort of our job, is to be a connector and to be knowledgeable about all sorts of things that might be helpful to a business. In times like this, when businesses can and should reach out for every bit of assistance they can, people like my team and the other Northern Virginia economic development groups are really knowledgeable not only about what's happening at the federal level, but potentially new programs coming from the state and local levels. And so if you don't know who your economic development office is, now's the right time to figure that out. You can go to novaeda.org, which is the collection of the 10 of us, and you can easily find who your economic developer is, no matter where you are in Nova.
And you probably just signed up for a flood of new calls, so you got that to look forward to.
It's good news that I have a great team who is really excited and embracing this new reality. While the circumstances are not ideal, one of the amazing things about working in our field is that you get to meet so many different people who are really building their dream of either building or running a business. And so it's really fulfilling in a time like this to be able to help people.
Well, we all appreciate your work and the work of people like you around the region that are helping the area get back on its feet and move forward again. Stephanie Landrum, the President and CEO of the Alexandria Economic Development Partnership. Thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you next time for the next edition of DemBiz Briefs. Take care.
Thanks, Chris.